I watched through the kitchen window as my stepmother's Mercedes pulled into the driveway, followed closely by my father's BMW and my stepsister Claire's brand new Audi, all bought with money that should have been mine. They were returning from their 2-week vacation in Europe, the one I'd been explicitly uninvited to, despite paying for half their expenses for the past 3 years. Claire stepped out first, designer luggage in hand, already reaching for her phone to post another humble brag about their family bonding time. My stepmother Patricia emerged next, laden with shopping bags from Paris boutiques, while my father stretched and smiled like a man without a care in the world. None of them noticed the official-looking papers taped to the front door. I set down my coffee cup and checked my watch. The moving truck I'd hired would arrive in exactly 30 minutes. My new apartment across town was already furnished and waiting. Everything I actually cared about, my grandmother's jewelry, my real mother's photos, my college diplomas, had been quietly relocated over the past week while they'd been sipping champagne in the City of Light. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my previous life, I'd died in this very kitchen, alone and forgotten, while they'd been on a similar vacation. Heart attack at 28, brought on by years of stress, overwork, and a lifetime of emotional abuse. I'd collapsed right here, reaching for my phone to call for help, only to remember that they'd disconnected my line 3 months earlier as motivation for me to become more independent. But that was my first life. This time, things would be different. Claire's shriek of outrage echoed across the neighborhood as she spotted the eviction notice. I opened the window slightly to hear better. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, ripping the paper from the door. "Patricia, Daddy, come look at this." My father's face went from vacation relaxed to thunderstorm dark in seconds. "This has to be a mistake. I'll call my lawyer." "The house has been sold," Patricia read aloud, her voice climbing higher with each word. "All occupants must vacate the premises within 24 hours as mandated by—" She stopped reading and looked around wildly. "Where's Elena? Elena!" I took my time walking to the front door, savoring every second of their panic. When I finally appeared, Claire immediately launched into attack mode. "What did you do?" she snarled, waving the papers in my face. "This is some kind of prank, isn't it? You forged these documents." I smiled calmly and pulled out my phone, showing them the official email confirmation from the county recorder's office. "The house sold last Tuesday. All legal, all legitimate. The new owners take possession tomorrow morning." My father's face had gone an alarming shade of purple. "That's impossible. This house is in my name. I bought it 15 years ago." "Actually, Dad, you're wrong about that. I'd been looking forward to this moment for 9 months, ever since I'd opened my eyes in this second life and realized I'd been given a chance to rewrite everything. The house was purchased with money from my trust fund, the one my biological mother left me when she died. The one you convinced me to loan you when I turned 18, remember?" The color drained from his face as the memory hit him. In my previous life, I'd been so desperate for their approval, so grateful for any scrap of affection, that I'd signed whatever papers they put in front of me. I'd trusted them when they said it was just temporary and that my name would be added to the deed soon. "But that was a loan," Patricia stammered. "You agreed to it." "I agreed to it because I was 18, grieving. And you told me it was the only way to keep our family together after Mom died." I pulled out another set of papers. But here's the thing about loans. They need to be documented properly. And according to the original paperwork I found in Dad's files, this was never structured as a loan. It was a purchase agreement. The house was bought with my inheritance money, which means I was always the legal owner. Claire's jaw dropped. "That's not possible. We've been living here for 15 years. "You've been living in my house for 15 years, I corrected. "I just never realized I had the power to do anything about it. Not until I did some research and found out that the deed was recorded incorrectly. The county had no record of the ownership transfer Dad claimed happened. I'd spent months in my second life working with lawyers, digging through public records and tracking down the paper trail. It had taken some creativity and a lot of patience, but the law was surprisingly clear. The house had been purchased with my money, the deed was improperly filed, and I was the rightful owner. "You can't do this to us," my father said, and for the first time in my life, I heard genuine fear in his voice. "We're family." "Are we?" I asked. Because family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't exclude one member from vacations while using her money to pay for them. Family doesn't take and take and take until there's nothing left. The moving truck rounded the corner right on schedule. I waved to the driver and gestured toward the driveway. "What are you doing?" Patricia shrieked. "Moving out my belongings. The new owners will need the space." "New owners?" Claire's voice cracked. "You sold it to strangers?" "Actually, I sold it to myself. Well, to the LLC I established last month." I couldn't keep the satisfaction out of my voice. "Elena Realty Holdings now owns this property, and as the property manager, I've decided not to renew your lease." "We don't have a lease," my father roared. "Exactly, which means you're squatters. The notice gives you 24 hours to remove your belongings and vacate the premises. I'm being generous. Legally, I could have you removed immediately." The movers began loading my boxes, and I supervised them with the calm efficiency of someone who'd planned this moment down to the minute. In my previous life, I'd died owning nothing but debt and broken dreams. This time, I'd systematically documented every dollar they'd taken from me, every promise they'd broken, every cruelty they'd inflicted. "Elena, please," Patricia said, switching to the fake sweet voice she used when she wanted something. "Let's discuss this like adults. Surely we can work something out." I turned to face her fully. "You want to discuss this like adults? Let's start with the $50,000 you stole from my college fund to pay for Claire's wedding. Or the $30,000 you took from my graduate school account to buy your car. Or the way you convinced me to work 3 jobs to pay for household expenses while you spent my trust fund money on luxury vacations I wasn't invited to." "That money was for the family," my father said weakly. "I wasn't considered family when it came to anything fun, was I? I was just the ATM, the live-in maid who paid rent and utilities and groceries while you all treated me like a servant." Claire was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and entitlement. "You're destroying our lives." "No, Claire, I'm reclaiming mine." In my previous life, their emotional manipulation would have worked. I would have backed down, apologized, found a way to make their comfort more important than my well-being. But death had given me perspective. Dying alone and forgotten while they lived it up on my money had burned away any remaining illusion that they were capable of loving me. "Where are we supposed to go?" Patricia demanded. "I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're all so resourceful when it comes to spending other people's money." I gestured to their designer luggage and shopping bags. "Maybe you can return some of those purchases you just made in Paris." "This is illegal," my father shouted. "I'll sue you." "With what money?" I asked pleasantly. "Your credit cards are maxed out. I know because I stopped paying them off 6 months ago. Your savings account is empty because you spent it all on this vacation. And your lawyer, the one you're threatening to call? He already looked into this for me. He says your case would be laughed out of court." That was a lie, but a calculated one. I'd actually hired 3 different lawyers to ensure my plan was bulletproof. Every document had been filed correctly, every legal requirement met. They could try to fight this in court, but they'd lose, and they'd go bankrupt in the process. The moving truck finished loading my belongings, and I handed the driver a generous tip. "Thanks for being so efficient." "No problem, miss. We'll have everything at your new place within the hour." As the truck pulled away, I turned back to my shell-shocked family. "I've left a list of local hotels on the kitchen counter. I'd suggest you start calling soon. Tourist season means availability is limited." "You're really going to leave us homeless?" Claire asked, mascara running down her cheeks. "You're not homeless. You have options. You can get jobs, find an apartment. Maybe learn what it's like to pay your own bills for once." I shrugged. "Think of it as character building." "Elena, honey," my father said, using the tone that had manipulated me for years. "I know we haven't always been perfect, but we love you. You're our daughter." The words that would have destroyed my resolve in my previous life now bounced off me like water off glass. If you loved me, you wouldn't have stolen from me. If you loved me, you wouldn't have treated me like a servant in my own home. If you loved me, you wouldn't have excluded me from family activities while using my money to pay for them. I walked to my car, keys in hand. "The water and electricity will be shut off tomorrow morning. The new owners want to renovate before they move in." Wait, Patricia called out. What about our things, our furniture, our clothes? What about them? You have 24 hours to remove whatever you want to keep. After that, anything left behind becomes property of the new owner. I opened my car door. I suggest you start packing. As I drove away, I watched them in my rearview mirror, standing in the driveway looking lost and helpless. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old guilt, the conditioned response to prioritize their needs over my own. But then, I remembered lying on that kitchen floor in my previous life, gasping for breath while they laughed and posted photos from their vacation, completely unaware that I was dying alone. The guilt evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of righteous satisfaction. My new apartment was everything theirs wasn't: clean, modern, and completely mine. No shared spaces where I'd be expected to clean up after people who treated me like hired help. No common areas where I'd be subjected to their constant criticism and demands. Just peace, quiet, and the freedom to live without walking on eggshells. I'd furnished it with pieces I actually liked, not the gaudy monstrosities Patricia had chosen for our house. The walls were painted in colors that made me happy, not the beige neutrality she'd insisted was more sophisticated. For the first time in my adult life, I was surrounded by things that reflected my personality instead of theirs. The first few days were blissful. I woke up when I wanted, ate what I pleased, and watched television shows they'd always complained about. I worked on hobbies they'd mocked and read books they'd called pretentious. I remembered what it felt like to exhale fully, to relax without constantly monitoring my environment for signs of their displeasure. They called, of course, hundreds of times. The voicemails started angry, then became pleading, then desperate. Claire left sobbing messages about how I was ruining her life and destroying the family. Patricia alternated between threats and fake apologies. My father tried the authoritative approach, demanding I fix this mess immediately. I deleted every message without listening to them completely. On the fourth day, they showed up at my apartment building. The security guard called to ask if I wanted to see them, and I politely declined. Through my window, I watched them argue in the parking lot before finally leaving. They returned the next day and the day after that, but I'd already given the building management their descriptions and clear instructions that they weren't welcome. By the end of the first week, their social media presence told the story I'd expected. Claire had moved in with her friend Madison, though her posts made it clear this was a temporary arrangement that was already wearing thin. Patricia was staying at a budget motel and had started a GoFundMe, claiming they were victims of a legal technicality. My father had moved in with his brother, and from the strained family photos, it was obvious that situation wasn't going well either. Their financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Without my money propping up their lifestyle, the cracks showed immediately. Credit card payments were missed, their cars were repossessed, and their social circle began to distance itself from the drama. Patricia's GoFundMe raised less than $500, mostly from people who didn't know the real story. I, meanwhile, was thriving. The money I'd spent on their expenses for years was now mine to keep. I'd never realized how much I'd been subsidizing their lifestyle until I saw my bank account growing instead of shrinking. I paid off my student loans, invested in index funds, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt financially secure. 3 weeks after the eviction, Claire showed up at my office. My assistant tried to stop her, but she pushed past and burst into my private workspace. "Elena, please," she begged, looking haggard and desperate. "I'm sorry, okay? We're all sorry. We made mistakes, but we're family. Family forgives each other." I looked up from my laptop without emotion. "Are you here to return the money you've stolen from me over the years?" "You know we don't have it anymore," she said, tears starting again. "But we can work something out. A payment plan. Or a payment plan with what income? None of you have jobs." "We're looking for work. It's just hard right now with the economy, and the economy has been fine, Claire. You've just never had to look for work before because I was paying for everything." I turned back to my laptop. "If that's all you came to say, my assistant will show you out." "You used to be kind," she said, her voice breaking. "You used to care about us. What happened to you?" I stopped typing and looked at her directly. "I died, Claire. I died alone in that kitchen while you were all living it up in Europe on my money." I died because the stress of supporting three adults who treated me like garbage literally stopped my heart. And when I got a second chance, I decided to choose myself for once. Her face went white. What are you talking about? You didn't die. You're right here. In my previous life, I died at 28. Heart attack brought on by stress and overwork. Do you want to know what my last thought was? It wasn't sadness or fear, it was relief. Relief that I wouldn't have to disappoint you anymore. Relief that I wouldn't have to apologize for existing anymore. Relief that I wouldn't have to watch you all spend my inheritance while treating me like an inconvenience. I stood up and walked around my desk to face her. But then, I woke up on my 21st birthday 9 months ago with all my memories intact. I got a second chance to live my life differently. And the first thing I decided was that I would never again prioritize your comfort over my survival. You're talking crazy, she whispered, but her eyes showed she was beginning to understand that something fundamental had changed in me. Maybe I am, or maybe dying gave me the clarity to see our relationship for what it really was. Either way, the result is the same. I'm done being your victim. Security arrived then, alerted by my assistant. Claire allowed herself to be escorted out, but she turned back at the door. This isn't over, she said, trying to inject some of her old authority into her voice. Yes, it is, I replied calmly. It's been over for a long time. You just didn't realize it. After she left, I called my lawyer to update him on the contact. He assured me that my restraining order application would be processed quickly, and that my building's security footage would support the harassment claim. Over the following months, I watched their lives continue to unravel while mine flourished. Patricia's motel money ran out, and she ended up in a women's shelter. My father's relationship with his brother deteriorated to the point of estrangement. Claire cycled through a series of temporary living situations, each one more desperate than the last. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but I felt no guilt either. They were experiencing the natural consequences of years of financial irresponsibility and emotional abuse. Without my money and labor to prop them up, their true situation became clear to everyone around them. I, meanwhile, had been promoted twice at work. My boss remarked on my increased confidence and focus, not knowing that I no longer had to rush home to cook dinner for people who criticized my cooking, or work weekends to pay bills for people who complained about my contributions. 6 months after the eviction, I was offered a position with a company in another state. The salary was excellent, the work was challenging, and most importantly, it was 3,000 miles away from my former family. I took the job without hesitation. My going-away party was small but genuine. Real friends who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. As I packed up my apartment, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. In my previous life, I died forgotten and alone. In this life, I was surrounded by people who actually cared about my well-being. The house I'd sold had been renovated beautifully by the new owners, a young couple with twin toddlers. I drove by it once before leaving town and smiled to see children's toys in the yard and warm light glowing from the windows. It was finally a home filled with love instead of manipulation. My father made one last attempt to contact me through my work email. The message was a masterpiece of projection and emotional manipulation, blaming me for destroying the family and abandoning them in their time of need. He claimed they'd learned their lesson and begged for one more chance. I forwarded the email to my lawyer and deleted it without responding. In my new city, I bought a small house with a garden and a view of the mountains. I adopted a rescue dog who followed me everywhere, grateful for kindness after a life of neglect. I joined a book club, took pottery classes, and started dating a man who was fascinated by my stories instead of threatened by my success. For the first time in either of my lives, I was genuinely happy. 2 years later, I received news that my father had died of a heart attack, the same condition that had killed me in my previous life. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia called to tell me about the funeral, expecting me to return and pay for the arrangements. I sent flowers and a brief condolence note, but I didn't attend. I'd grieved the loss of a real father years ago, when I'd finally accepted that the man who'd raised me was incapable of love. Claire reached out through social media, sharing photos of the modest memorial service and tagging me with comments about family duty and forgiveness. I blocked her account and increased my privacy settings. My life had no room for their drama anymore. 3 years after leaving, I was promoted to regional manager. My team respected me, my superiors valued my judgment, and my personal life was rich with genuine relationships. I'd published a small book about financial independence that had done surprisingly well, and I was considering a second one about recognizing and escaping emotional manipulation. On the fourth anniversary of my rebirth, I threw myself a small celebration. Just me, my dog, and a bottle of good wine as I sat in my garden watching the sunset. I thought about my previous life, the loneliness, the constant anxiety, the gradual erosion of my self-worth under the weight of their expectations. Then I thought about the choices I'd made in this life, the decision to research my legal rights instead of accepting their version of reality, the courage to prioritize my well-being over their comfort, the strength to walk away from people who had never truly valued me. I raised my glass to the memory of the woman who had died alone in that kitchen, grateful for the wisdom her suffering had given me. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the permission to leave. Sometimes family isn't about blood or obligation, it's about choosing people who choose you back. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get a second chance to build the life you actually deserve. As the stars came out over my mountain view, I smiled and went inside to call my real family, the friends who celebrated my successes, supported my dreams, and loved me not for what I could provide, but for who I was. The girl who had died forgotten had been reborn into a woman who would never be overlooked again. In my 5th year of this second life, I received an unexpected visitor. My assistant buzzed me during a Thursday afternoon meeting to tell me that a woman named Patricia Garrett was in the lobby, claiming to be my stepmother and insisting it was urgent. I excused myself from the conference room and looked down from my corner office window. There she was, dramatically aged and wearing clothes I didn't recognize. Not the designer pieces she'd once favored, but discount store basics that had seen better days. Her hair, once professionally styled weekly, was now poorly cut and streaked with premature gray. "Tell her I'm not available," I instructed my assistant, "and please call building security to have her escorted out." But as I watched her through the window, something about her posture struck me. The arrogance was gone. The entitlement that had once made her carry herself like royalty had been replaced by the defeated slouch of someone who had finally run out of options. Against my better judgment, I changed my mind. "Actually, give me 5 minutes to finish my meeting, then send her up." When Patricia entered my office, I barely recognized her. The woman who had once commanded attention with her dramatic gestures and imperious demands now seemed to shrink into herself. She sat in the chair across from my desk without being invited, a liberty she never would have dared take in our old dynamic. "You look good," she said quietly, glancing around at my awards and certifications. "Successful." "I am successful," I replied, not offering her any of the usual pleasantries. "What do you want, Patricia?" "Claire's in the hospital," she said without preamble. She attempted suicide 3 days ago." I felt a flicker of something, not quite sympathy, but a distant echo of the person I used to be. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" Patricia's voice carried a note of challenge that reminded me of old arguments. "Because she did it on the anniversary of when you threw us out. She said in her note that she couldn't live with the guilt anymore." "The guilt of what? Stealing from me for years, treating me like a servant in my own home? Excluding me from family events while spending my money?" I kept my voice level. "Or the guilt of getting caught?" Patricia flinched. "She's in intensive care, Elena. The doctors don't know if she'll recover fully. There might be brain damage." "And you're telling me this because despite everything, she's your sister. And because I hoped, that maybe some part of the old Elena was still in there. The Elena who used to care about us." I leaned back in my chair, studying this broken woman who had once terrorized me with her mood swings and manipulations. "The old Elena died, Patricia. She died of stress and heartbreak at 28, alone in a kitchen while her family vacationed on her money. What you're looking at now is someone who learned the difference between kindness and doormat behavior." "She mentions you in therapy," Patricia continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Claire does, when she's lucid. She talks about how much she misses you, how sorry she is. The therapist says unresolved guilt is part of what drove her to—" "Stop," I held up a hand. "Don't you dare try to make me responsible for Claire's mental health. I am not the villain in this story, Patricia. I was the victim who finally fought back. I'm not saying you're the villain, she said quickly. I'm saying maybe we could find a way to heal as a family. The laugh that escaped me was sharp and humorless. Family? You mean the group of people who stole my inheritance, excluded me from vacations, made me work 3 jobs to pay their bills, and treated me like hired help for years? That family? We made mistakes, Patricia admitted, and I was surprised to see tears in her eyes. Terrible mistakes. But Claire is dying, Elena. Whatever anger you have toward us, whatever we did to deserve it, please don't let her die thinking you hate her. I stood and walked to my window, looking out at the city I'd built a new life in. From this height, I could see the park where I walked my dog every morning, the restaurant where I'd had my first date with David, the bookstore where I'd done my first author reading. I could see the life I'd built from nothing, using only my own resources and determination. I don't hate Claire, I said finally. I don't hate any of you. But I also don't trust you, and I don't owe you anything. If Claire is struggling with guilt, that's between her and her therapist. If she attempted suicide, that's a tragedy, but it's not my responsibility to fix. She's your sister, Patricia said again, her voice breaking. No, she's not. I turned back to face her. A sister doesn't steal from you. A sister doesn't exclude you from family activities. A sister doesn't treat you like a servant and then expect gratitude for the privilege. Claire was my stepsister who helped abuse me for years. The fact that we shared a house doesn't make us family. Patricia was crying openly now. What about forgiveness? What about mercy? I have forgiven you, actually. All of you. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger was poisoning my life. I returned to my desk and sat down. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean I have to put myself back in a position to be hurt again. Then what would it take? She asked desperately. For you to visit her? To give her some peace? I considered the question seriously. It would take a time machine, Patricia. It would take the ability to go back and undo years of emotional abuse. It would take you all developing empathy and kindness and basic human decency. Since none of those things are possible, there's nothing you can offer me. Money? She suggested weakly. We could pay you back somehow. With what money? And even if you could, would that give me back the years I spent walking on eggshells in my own home? Would it return the self-esteem you all systematically destroyed? Would it restore the relationship with my father that you poisoned with your manipulation? She had no answer for that. Here's what I'll do, I said, surprising myself. I'll send flowers to the hospital. I'll include a card saying I hope Claire recovers. But I won't visit, I won't call, and I won't pretend that a suicide attempt erases years of abuse. That's it? Patricia asked. That's more than you deserve. After she left, I did send the flowers. Not because I felt obligated, but because the gesture cost me nothing and might provide some small comfort to a person who is suffering. I wrote a simple card, wishing you a full recovery. May you find peace and healing. I heard nothing for months after that. Then, almost a year later, I received a letter forwarded through my publisher. It was from Claire, written in shaky handwriting that suggested ongoing neurological effects from her attempt. The letter was long, rambling, and surprisingly honest. She talked about growing up feeling like she had to compete with me for attention and resources. She admitted that she'd resented my academic success and my natural ability to make friends. She acknowledged that their treatment of me had been cruel and that she'd participated willingly because it made her feel superior. Most surprising of all, she didn't ask for anything. No reconciliation, no forgiveness, no dramatic reunion. She simply wanted me to know that she understood what they'd done to me was wrong, and that she was working with therapists to understand why she'd thought it was acceptable. I know I'll never be able to undo the harm we caused, she wrote near the end, but I wanted you to know that at least one of us finally sees it clearly. You deserved so much better than what we gave you. I hope your new life is everything you wanted it to be. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. It was well written and seemed genuine, but it changed nothing fundamental about our relationship. Claire had finally developed some self-awareness, which was good for her own healing process, but it didn't create an obligation for me to re-engage. The following year brought news that my father's brother, the uncle who had briefly housed him after the eviction, had died and left his estate to a dog rescue organization. Patricia called to inform me, apparently hoping I'd feel some family obligation to help with funeral expenses. "I'm sorry for your loss," I told her politely, "but I won't be contributing to any arrangements." "He was your uncle," she protested weakly, her voice carrying none of its old authority. "He was my father's brother. I met him twice in my entire life. Both times at family gatherings I paid for but wasn't really welcome at." I kept my tone neutral but firm. "If you need financial assistance with the funeral, I suggest you contact other family members or look into county assistance programs." The call ended with her quietly hanging up, and I realized it was probably the last time we'd speak. The family structure that had once seemed so permanent and unbreakable had completely dissolved. The people who had dominated my first life were now scattered strangers, dealing with the consequences of their choices. Meanwhile, my own chosen family continued to grow and flourish. David and I had gotten engaged, and his family had welcomed me with the kind of unconditional warmth I'd never experienced before. His mother sent me care packages. His father asked my opinion on everything from investments to restaurant recommendations, and his siblings included me in group chats and family traditions without a second thought. The contrast was startling. With David's family, I was valued for my personality, my insights, my humor. They celebrated my professional successes and supported me through setbacks. When I mentioned my complicated history with my biological family, they listened with genuine sympathy but never pushed for details or suggested I owed anyone forgiveness. "You can't choose the family you're born into," David's mother told me one evening as we cooked dinner together. "But you can choose the family you keep. And we're very glad you chose us." It was exactly the kind of thing Patricia had never said to me, despite having 16 years to figure it out. 7 years after my rebirth, I received one final communication from my past. It was a death notice for Patricia, forwarded by a lawyer handling her estate. She'd died in a state-subsidized nursing home, alone, except for the staff. The notice indicated that she'd listed me as next of kin, despite our estrangement. The lawyer called to inform me that Patricia's estate consisted primarily of debts, but that there were some personal effects, photo albums, jewelry, documents, that I could claim if I wanted them. "What about Claire?" I asked. "Claire Garrett is in a long-term care facility," the lawyer explained. "The suicide attempt left her with significant cognitive impairment. She's not capable of making these decisions." I thought about it for several days. Finally, I asked the lawyer to send me just one thing: a small photo album that contained pictures of my biological mother. Everything else could be donated or disposed of as he saw fit. When the album arrived, I spent an evening going through it slowly. There were pictures of my mother holding me as a baby, teaching me to walk, reading to me. In every photo, her love was visible and uncomplicated. She looked at me the way David's family looked at me now, with genuine affection and pride. I'd been too young when she died to remember most of these moments. But seeing the photographic evidence of how much she'd loved me was healing in ways I hadn't expected. It reminded me that my capacity for love and my expectation of kindness weren't character flaws. They were gifts from a woman who had died too young to protect me from the people who would exploit those qualities. That night, I called David's mother and told her about the photos. She listened quietly, then said, "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become. Look how you turned all that pain into wisdom, all that hurt into strength." It was the kind of thing I'd always wished Patricia would say, the kind of validation I'd spent years desperately seeking from people who were incapable of providing it. A month later, David and I were married in a small ceremony, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about our happiness. As I walked down the aisle toward the man who loved me unconditionally, I thought about both versions of my life. In my first life, I died believing I was unworthy of love, convinced that my value lay only in what I could provide for others. In this life, I'd learned that real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself, and real family doesn't ask you to carry their weight at the expense of your own well-being. During the reception, as I danced with my new husband, while his grandmother took countless photos and his cousins serenaded us with increasingly ridiculous songs, I felt a deep sense of completion. This was what family was supposed to feel like. This was what love looked like when it wasn't transactional. Later that evening, as David and I sat on our hotel balcony watching the ocean, I told him about my rebirth theory for the first time. I'd never shared the details with anyone, afraid they'd think I was delusional. "So you think you actually died and came back?" he asked thoughtfully. "I know how it sounds," I said, "but the memories are so clear. The pain of that first death, the moment I opened my eyes on my 21st birthday knowing exactly what was going to happen. The way I was able to anticipate and prevent every manipulation they tried." David was quiet for a moment, processing. "Whether it was literal rebirth or just the moment you finally saw the situation clearly," he said finally, "the important thing is that you found the strength to change your life. You saved yourself, Elena. That's what matters." He was right, of course. Whether my experience was supernatural or psychological, the result was the same. I'd broken free from a cycle of abuse and built a life worth living. 10 years after my rebirth, I published my second book, The Price of Belonging: Recognizing and Escaping Financial Abuse in Families. It became a bestseller, resonating with thousands of readers who recognized their own experiences in my story. I received letters from adult children who'd been guilt-tripped into supporting their parents' lifestyles, from siblings who'd been treated as ATMs by their families, from people who'd never realized that financial exploitation was a form of abuse. Many of them thanked me for giving them permission to set boundaries and prioritize their own well-being. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a young woman named Sarah, who'd been supporting her entire extended family since graduating college. After reading my book, she'd moved out, established financial boundaries, and was working toward her own goals for the first time. "You saved my life," she wrote. "I was headed down the same path you described, working myself to death for people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. Thank you for showing me that choosing myself wasn't selfish." I framed that letter and hung it in my office next to my diplomas and awards. It reminded me daily that my painful experiences had been transformed into something meaningful, something that could help others avoid the same trap. The book tour took me to cities across the country, and everywhere I spoke, I met people with similar stories. The details were different. Some dealt with siblings who refused to work, others with parents who'd stolen their children's identities for credit. But the emotional patterns were the same. Guilt, obligation, and fear of abandonment kept people trapped in relationships that were slowly destroying them. "The hardest part," I told one audience, "is accepting that love isn't supposed to hurt. We're taught that family means sacrifice, but we're not taught to recognize when sacrifice becomes self-destruction. There's a difference between helping someone you love and enabling someone who's exploiting you." After each speaking engagement, people would approach me with their own stories. Many asked the same question: "How do I know if I'm overreacting? How do I know if it's really abuse or if I'm just being selfish?" My answer was always the same. If you're asking that question, you probably already know the answer. People in healthy relationships don't walk on eggshells. They don't constantly question their own judgment. They don't feel guilty for having needs and boundaries. 15 years after my rebirth, I established a foundation to help people escape financial abuse in families. We provided legal assistance, financial counseling, and emotional support to individuals trying to break free from exploitative relationships. The foundation was funded by profits from my books and speaking engagements, creating a virtuous cycle where my pain was transformed into help for others. Claire died that year. The lawyer called to inform me that she'd passed peacefully in her sleep, her cognitive function having gradually declined since her suicide attempt. He asked if I wanted to claim her body or arrange for burial. "Are there any other family members who might handle it?" I asked. "None that we can locate. You're the only person listed in her records." I arranged for a simple cremation and burial, paid for through my foundation rather than personally. It seemed fitting, helping someone in need, even someone who had once hurt me, without the gesture requiring anything personal from me. I didn't attend the burial, but I sent flowers with a card that simply said, "Rest in peace." It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It was basic human compassion for someone who had suffered the consequences of her choices. That evening, David found me sitting in our garden with tears in my eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked, sitting beside me on the bench we'd built together. "I think I'm grieving," I said. Not for Claire as she was, but for the sister she could have been, for the family we all could have been if they'd chosen differently. That's natural, he said, putting his arm around me. You can mourn the relationship you deserve to have while still protecting yourself from the relationship you actually had. 20 years after my rebirth, I was invited to speak at a conference on family trauma and recovery. As I stood at the podium looking out at an audience of therapists, social workers, and survivors, I reflected on the journey that had brought me there. Some people believe that forgiveness requires reconciliation, I said. They think that healing means returning to relationships that harmed you. But I've learned that sometimes the greatest act of forgiveness is forgiving yourself for staying too long, for giving too much, for believing you deserved less than you actually did. The audience was silent, absorbed in every word. In my first life, and yes, I say first life because sometimes we have to die to ourselves to be reborn, I believed that love meant sacrifice. I thought my worth was measured by how much I could give and how little I required in return. I died at 28, literally and figuratively, believing I was unlovable. I paused, looking out at faces that reflected understanding and recognition. In my second life, I learned that love is supposed to be mutual. That family should be a source of support, not a drain on your resources. That setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's necessary for survival. And that sometimes the family you choose is more real than the family you're born into. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Afterward, dozens of people approached me to share their own stories of escape and recovery. Many thanked me for validating their choice to leave toxic family situations, and one woman, probably in her 60s, took my hands and said, "I've been feeling guilty for cutting contact with my daughters for 30 years. They were stealing from me, manipulating me, making my life miserable. But everyone said I should forgive them because they're family. Thank you for reminding me that I'm allowed to protect myself." As I drove home that night, I thought about the woman I'd been in my first life, desperate for approval, willing to accept crumbs of affection, convinced that her suffering was somehow noble. Then, I thought about the woman I'd become, confident, surrounded by genuine love, using her experience to help others. The transformation hadn't been easy or instant. It had taken years of therapy, careful boundary setting, and the constant choice to prioritize my well-being over others' comfort. But it had been worth every difficult moment. At home, David was waiting with dinner and stories about his day. Our dog, now gray-muzzled but still enthusiastic, greeted me with the kind of uncomplicated joy I'd once thought was impossible. We ate together, talked about our plans for the weekend, laughed at a ridiculous movie we'd started watching. It was ordinary and perfect, the kind of life I'd never imagined possible when I was lying on that kitchen floor in my first life, gasping for breath while my family partied without me. 25 years after my rebirth, I was diagnosed with the same heart condition that had killed me in my first life. The doctor explained that it was genetic, likely to have manifested regardless of my lifestyle choices. But, he added, looking at my test results, your stress levels are remarkably low for someone with this condition. That's probably why it took so long to develop symptoms. Emotional well-being has a significant impact on cardiac health. David held my hand as we discussed treatment options. The condition was manageable with medication and lifestyle modifications. I would likely live a normal lifespan, especially given my overall health and happiness. Ironic, I said as we left the doctor's office. The same condition that killed me at 28 will probably be just a minor inconvenience now. That's what peace does for you, David replied. When you're not constantly fighting for your right to exist, your body can actually focus on healing. As I took my first cardiac medication that evening, I reflected on the strange symmetry of it all. In my first life, my heart had literally broken under the weight of toxic relationships and emotional abuse. In this life, surrounded by love and support, the same genetic predisposition was merely a medical condition to be managed. 30 years after my rebirth, I was preparing for retirement. My foundation was thriving under new leadership. My books were being translated into multiple languages, and I'd trained dozens of therapists and advocates in recognizing and addressing family financial abuse. David and I had never had children, a choice that had initially concerned his family, but which we never regretted. We'd poured our nurturing energy into our work, our community, and each other. Our life was full of meaning without being full of obligation. On the 30th anniversary of selling the house, I drove past it one final time. The young family who'd bought it from my LLC had raised their children there and recently sold it to new young parents. The cycle continued, a home filled with love instead of manipulation. I parked across the street and sat for a few minutes, remembering the woman who had died in that kitchen and the woman who had been reborn with a chance to choose differently. Both versions of me had lived in that house, but only one had been truly alive. As I prepared to drive away, I whispered a thank you to my first self, for suffering enough to create wisdom, for dying enough to understand the value of life, for leaving me the gift of perspective that had made everything possible. Then I drove home to David, to our dog, to the dinner we'd cooked together and the life we'd built on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine love. Some stories are about revenge. Some are about justice. But this story, I realized, was about resurrection, not just coming back from the dead, but coming back to life. And that, I thought, as I pulled into our driveway, was the greatest victory of all.